aren't already, please go follow Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and subscribe to their YouTube channel. They post really helpful stream reminders. So on their Instagram stories, they'll tell you when our upcoming streams are. Also, Fiveable has AP support for over 10 subjects this year, from English to calculus to statistics to biology and physics. So you should definitely check out the other AP subjects too. But I love talking about AP English language, and that's what we're going to get into today. So today in this stream, we're going to first start off with a rhetorical analysis overview. The first thing you're going to do after your first read of an article or some sort of speech, then we'll be covering ethos, logos, pathos, rhetorical techniques, and end with rhetorical devices. Throughout today's stream, my goal is to make this as interactive as possible, meaning that I really want to be like interacting with y'all rather than just lecturing for an hour, because that's pretty boring. Also, this stream is scheduled to last about 40 to 50 minutes or so. It may run longer or shorter depending on how interactive y'all are and how many questions y'all have for me. Important question. That question is, how do you define rhetorical analysis? So leave like maybe a 5 to 7 word description in the chat. Let me know what you think rhetorical analysis is, or tell me what your teachers have told you what rhetorical analysis is. Be glad to hear y'all's input. Analyzing the choices a writer makes to achieve their purpose. That is a spot-on definition. Good job. I completely agree. You're basically looking at what the writer did in their essay rather than what they said, and you're trying to figure out how that achieves their purpose. That is a really, really good way of describing rhetorical analysis. How to analyze how persuasive a writer and how they achieved it. Yeah, basically how persuasive a writer is and what they did to get to that point of persuasion. That's a good start, Kim. Thank you so much. Appreciate the feedback. Those are 2 really good answers. I think like the thing you want to get away with is the English 1 and English 2 mindset of, oh, we're gonna be like summarizing the article, right? We wanna get away from summary and we wanna get towards analysis, and those are 2 really good examples of how we're going to analyze. So let's begin with an overview of rhetorical analysis. The thing that my AP English language teacher repeated to me over and over, and what I'm always going to tell anyone, like whoever asks me about rhetorical analysis, is that summary is death. You never want to be restating anything really that the author is doing in your rhetorical analysis essay, with the exception of maybe giving like a 3-word, like basically the main idea of that speaker in the thesis. Besides that, in the core of your rhetorical analysis, you never want to summarize. But as you said, I would say that rhetorical analysis is pretty much breaking down a text to analyze how an author writes rather than what they wrote. And basically, you're analyzing how the devices or techniques they had in their text contributed to their author's purpose. Basically, why did that author use that device, and how does that contribute to their purpose? As you can see with that word bubble down there, you can see a lot of different examples about how we're looking at the rhetorical triangle, how the author links to the audience and how that also links to their writing. So basically, you're just analyzing what they did in that article to basically make their article as persuasive as it is. So as you can see by the title of today's stream, we're going to be looking at identifying what is worth analyzing. So what's really important is that after your first time reading that speech or article or address or whatever article you're doing a rhetorical analysis over, the most important thing is that you need to figure out the author's purpose, their intended audience, and their tone. What I would do is usually like to the right of that article in the margins or in the bottom right or bottom left, or excuse me, top left, I would just write purpose, I'd write their purpose, I'd write their intended audience, and I would label their tone. These 3 things are critical to any rhetorical analysis, because throughout your essay, you're going to be linking back to that purpose, you're going to be linking back to how they're convincing that audience, and you're also going to be talking about tone. Remember, these articles are not going to have one consistent tone throughout the entire essay. And tone is the author's attitude towards that subject, or the writer's attitude towards that subject. So essentially, you want to be maybe mentioning where there are tone shifts or where there are changes in what the author is trying to express. In addition, it's really important that you annotate after your first read. Look for things like syntax, which is the organization of paragraphs, the different lengths of sentences. You can also look for unique diction that kind of indicates some sort of tone, imagery, rhetorical devices and techniques, and appeals to emotion, authority, and logic or reasoning. That means things like words or images that kind of indicate that they're trying to appeal to the audience's emotion, make them upset, make them angry, make them passionate. Appeals to authority, kind of talking about how they have some kind of credibility and how like some leader or some person who had some authority also believed in their same ideas, or even an appeal to logic or reasoning. Basically, like common sense says this, or citing studies or statistics, basically numbers that prove their point. Also, I think another thing that is kind of emphasized in the first 2 years of high school, if you take English language as a junior, is that you kind of learn that annotating is just underlining or highlighting. As you may or may not know, on the AP English language test, you are not allowed to use a highlighter, and all you get is pens and pencils. So what that means is that you need to be annotating and writing notes. It doesn't just mean like labeling it. Like you need to explain how that connects to their author's purpose, how it connects to that intended audience and their tone. Because remember, rhetorical analysis is showing how the writer used some kind of device, used a technique to help achieve their purpose. And so if you do that in the annotation process, it makes it much easier than when you're trying to write the essay and you like label the rhetorical device and you're like, I don't know how it achieves their purpose. So it's better for you to do that in the first step in the process rather than in the end. Before I continue on, does anyone have any questions? You can leave it in the Ask a Question tab, or you can leave it in the chat. I'd be happy to answer it. I'll wait like 15 more seconds. Also, just so you know, rhetorical devices, techniques, and those appeals to emotion, authority, and logic, I'm going to cover those in the next few slides or so. So hold on those questions because I'm just about to elaborate on them. But otherwise, I guess we'll move on. So I think what's important for rhetorical analysis is 3 steps. I came up with this acronym in the moment, IDA. First, you need to identify that rhetorical device. So you need to know if there's simile, if there's an appeal to emotion, if there's personification, if there's some kind of technique or a choice that the writer made to kind of enhance that essay. So first you have to identify. So that means underlining, boxing it, right? Then you have to decide. You have to decide if that rhetorical device actually makes an impact in their author's persuasion. So whether or not that simile or that personification makes their argument stronger, or if it makes the audience want them to listen more, something like that, that's the second step, decision. So first you identify, you find that device, you make sure like it's a rhetorical technique or it's a choice that the author made. Then you have to decide whether or not it actually contributes to the writer's purpose. And the final step, and the most important step that oftentimes AP Lang students lose out on, is analyzing. Analysis is not summary. It's not saying this is a simile because they used like or as. It's not this is personification because the trees were talking like humans. Remember, analysis means that you're taking your own interpretation from that rhetorical device and talking about how that creates some kind of impact. It should be in your own words without like using first person. So for instance, the author uses simile because it makes readers more interested and gives them a real life comparison to their life about what they're talking about. That's an example of analysis, because what you're doing is you're taking the author's rhetorical device and putting it in the perspective of the reader and basically talking about how that helps them achieve their purpose. So once again, I think I mentioned this at the very beginning, but when you're analyzing any kind of rhetorical device, it's really important that you do 2 things. The first is you explain why they use that device. That's the first step of analysis. You want to talk about, oh, why did they use simile here? Why did they use ethos? Why do they use logos? The reason as to why they did that is because of X, Y, and Z reasons. The next thing you have to do is talk about how that specific rhetorical device helps them achieve their purpose. So if their purpose is to convince people that the oil industry is really problematic and that big businesses are harmful to the average worker, then you talk about how the appeal to emotion convinces people that, for instance, big business is actually not helping the economy and is actually hurting the lower class citizens, something like that. So make sure that you have both parts when you're analyzing and when you're identifying what is worth analyzing. So first, let's talk about ethos, logos, and pathos. So I actually put them in reverse order because I think you'll usually find pathos and logos more than ethos within your essays. And also, I strongly encourage you, like after learning what ethos, logos, and pathos are, to never, ever, ever use them in your rhetorical analysis essays. Instead, I would call them appeals to emotions, appeals to logic or reasoning, and an appeal to credibility or trust. So pathos, or the appeal to emotion, is usually found in speeches or addresses. So if you've done a rhetorical analysis practice, you've probably maybe seen like JFK, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, these like presidents or key historical leaders like Martin Luther King or Florence Kelley. These key historical figures oftentimes utilize pathos because they're trying to rally up the audience with a call to action, or they're trying to make people angry or passionate or something of that sort. That's really what pathos is all about. It's also using some kind of sad or melancholy emotion to try and convince the audience that, like something is problematic and we need to solve it. There's also a really obvious example of pathos that exists in almost every single article you're going to read, and that's a build up to some kind of conclusion. So they'll use things like periodic sentences to basically try and create this like impactful, like this impact at the end. Also, if you see this little chart down here where it says pathos in the bottom right corner, you can see that using stories, inspirational quotes, or vivid language, those are all examples of pathos. And that shows how these appeals also interact with rhetorical devices and rhetorical techniques. Because without effective diction that is emotional or imagery, you can't even have pathos, because how else do you communicate it? So both of them work hand in hand. There's also logos. So if you're usually reading something science or mathematics related, you usually get some kind of logos, things like statistics or figures or case studies that prove their point. That's pretty much the biggest example of logos, but also things like analogies and comparisons and metaphors. These are all examples of logos, because what the audience is doing, what the author is doing essentially is that they're trying to link their argument with something else that readers know about. So that's actually an appeal to logic and reasoning, because what they're doing is they're taking their argument and expanding it and comparing it across multiple different spheres, I guess. Finally, there's ethos. I say that it's usually found in all genres, but I would advise against it. An appeal to credibility doesn't often appear in many rhetorical analysis essays. Like, you won't see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talking about how he's an anti-slavery, or excuse me, he's an anti-segregationist or something like that. But usually you'll see, to some extent, some kind of author credibility. If you see a concession to opposition, that's a big example of ethos. And even subject-specific diction, using things like correlation or causation, or think like if you're reading an article about economics and you see words like gentrification. These are all examples of ethos, because what they're doing is that they're appealing to that like credibility, and like they seem to know what they're talking about. And that's exactly what ethos is all about. Does anyone have any questions about ethos, logos, and pathos? Or do you want me to elaborate or re-explain anything? If so, please leave a comment or leave something in the chat box, or just ask in the Ask a Question tab. I'd be happy to answer. I'll wait about 30 seconds or so. Okay, cool. Can you go over subject-specific diction again? Yeah, I can. So subject-specific diction just means that they're using terminology that's specific to their field. So if you're reading some article about science, right? And I don't think this will usually show up for rhetorical analysis, but it might. So if on the AP exam you get an article about, let's say, chemistry, and how they're conducting experiments with CRISPR, which is like a gene that can like basically like solve a lot of humanity's problems. I'm not like a STEM major. I don't know science very much, so I wouldn't really know about it. But basically, if they were to use terminology like transcription or translation, things that you learned in like your pre-AP biology class, if they use terms that are kind of like terms that only people in that kind of expertise they use, I would classify that as ethos. Or as I mentioned earlier, like if you're reading something about economics and they're talking about the laws of supply and demand, or they're talking about comparative advantage, or like any kind of economic specific terms, that is also ethos. Does that make sense? I hope that explanation kind of comes through. I think oftentimes people don't know that that's ethos. They just think, oh, it's them sounding smart. And I guess it is like more so diction, but yeah. Okay, great. I'm glad that helped. And once again, everyone, if you need like any help with any like questions, or you want me to re-explain anything, just tell me in the chat and I'll re-explain it. Or you can even leave like an ask a question tab, because I'm actually running ahead. So we have plenty of time to like answer any questions, or even have like a mini Q&A. All right, so let's have an appeals quiz. So it's gonna be a quick quiz. Just tell me if something is ethos, logos, or pathos. So let's start off with this. My ideology completely aligns with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. Is this ethos, logos, or pathos? Leave your answer in the chat. And it's okay if you're wrong. Like, this isn't like a grade or anything. So I'll give you about 30 seconds. Maybe like 15. Yep, you're right. It is ethos. The reason as to why it's ethos is because of the keywords completely aligns. When you say, like, for instance, in the words of Malala, right, when you're using things like aligns or completely agrees with, that's an example of ethos, because what you're doing is you're appealing to some sort of credibility. You're saying, oh, what I'm saying, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. also said, and he's like a key influential leader. All right, let's try the next one. It's the hope of slaves sitting around a fire singing freedom songs, the hope of immigrants setting out for distant shores, the hope of a young naval lieutenant bravely patrolling the Mekong Delta by Barack Obama. Is that ethos, logos, or pathos? Yep, that's correct. It is pathos. And the reason why it's pathos, you can see it actually through the parallel structure. So what Barack Obama does in this quote, our former president, at his speech, I believe, to the Democratic National Convention in 2004, is that he used this kind of parallel structure to talk about hope, to try and bring out this emotion within the Democratic, like the Democrat audience, to basically kind of rally up support. That's why it's pathos. And finally, the last one, obviously, I'm not going to repeat anything. According to a study conducted by researchers from Cornell University, each additional adult refugee increases annual real income in the local economy by $253, significantly more than the $126 in aid each refugee receives. What would that be? I don't know. If we've already done ethos and pathos, I guess it has to be the other one. Yeah, it's logos. And the reason why it's logos is because they're citing some kind of study to back their assertion. So in this case, an assertion, like you could basically, maybe there's an article about refugees and how people believe that refugees take away from our economy. And the study from Cornell basically says that that's not true, and that each additional adult refugee, because they pay like tax revenue, they increase annual real income. Fun fact. All right, fantastic. Does anyone else have any other questions about ethos, logos, and pathos before we move on to rhetorical techniques and devices? Otherwise, we'll keep it rolling. All right, we'll move on. So now we're getting into rhetorical techniques. So I don't know if your AP English language teacher uses different acronyms. I'm a convert to DIDLS. It just means diction, imagery, details, language, and syntax. I've seen a bunch of other acronyms, both as an AP English literature student and even walking into my old AP English language teacher's classroom. I think she switched to a new acronym. I don't even remember what it was, but it was interesting. So all these concepts and terms exist in different literary passages. So what I always remember is that every passage will have diction. Every passage will have some kind of language. It will have some kind of syntax or sentence structure. But what you have to do is add an adjective in front of it, or you have to explain or elaborate. So syntax means, oh, they had a bunch of long sentences and suddenly they had a short sentence. And that like short sentence adds emphasis. That's an example of syntax and how it helps achieve, like why that author used it to create emphasis. And then you link to their purpose, essentially. Also, you never, ever, ever want to be saying words like the author uses diction or the author uses details, because that is just redundant, because every article or passage or address that you read will have details, because details are what makes up an article or an argument, essentially. And diction is just words. So as I said earlier, make sure that you're describing using passionate diction, using key like details about someone or something, right? You really want to make sure that you are as descriptive and as specific as possible when you're talking about rhetorical techniques. Also, like techniques and devices all kind of fall under the umbrella of rhetorical choices. And those choices, as someone mentioned at the very beginning of the stream, is what we're talking about in rhetorical analysis. You're basically explaining how the author made some decision. For instance, they decided to add that short sentence, or they decided to include vivid imagery that triggers, like, for instance, your auditory imagery or your visual imagery. That kind of rhetorical technique is what is like a choice that the author made. And then what you're doing in that essay is you're talking about how the author's choice to use that diction or use that imagery helps contribute to their purpose. And if you have any questions, once again, leave them in the chat or leave them in the Ask a Question tab, and I will get to it. Okay, we will move on to rhetorical devices now. So I just put a huge long list, and I'm sure your AP English language teachers are going to go through some of them, but I'll explain a few of them, because I would say that out of this long, exhaustive list of like 20 rhetorical devices, maybe like 5 to 7 of them will show up in an individual like passage or essay. So allusion is like historical references. You'll usually see this in some AP English language, like addresses. So people will cite back to the ancient Greeks or the ancient Rome, excuse me, or the Greeks, or they'll talk about some kind of past civilization or some key leader. That's an allusion. And I guess I'll explain the impact of each one. So I guess what I'll do in this slide basically is I'll explain what the allusion is, and then how it connects to the author's purpose and what it does. So the reason why an author might use an allusion is to build credibility. I think it's a form of ethos. And also, by using allusion, it kind of gives the audience an example of a leader who's done it before, and I kind of build some kind of impact that contributes to their purpose. An analogy is a comparison. So apples to, I don't even know where I was going with that. Like red is to apples, like oranges to oranges. That was kind of dumb. But an analogy, once again, is a form of logic or an appeal to logic. And that goes hand in hand with logos. So the reason why an author might use logos or an analogy is because they want to make themselves seem credible, and they want to give that audience the sense of feeling like relatable, I guess. Like, oh, this problem also exists in my own life in a different way. There's also anaphora, which is basically the repetition of the same kind of sentence beginnings. You'll see this all the time in AP English language rhetorical analysis prompts. So basically they'll say, the darkness won't consume us. The darkness will make us thrive. So beginning each sentence with the darkness, the darkness, the darkness. Having the same sentence beginnings is anaphora. And the reason why the author is doing that is, once again, to create emphasis. But as my AP English language teacher always said, emphasis means nothing. You have to elaborate what emphasizing means. So emphasis in that case would just mean they're trying to place a spotlight and make this issue basically stand out. And they're trying to bring the audience's attention to that one point. And that's what anaphora does. It kind of brings attention to that specific area. Also, if you disagree with any of my interpretations, feel free to like leave a comment and be like, hey, I don't think that anaphora does that. Or I think anaphora also serves this function, because I think most of y'all probably have been like reading some books in class and you've had to do that annotating where you're finding anaphora in some kind of novel. So if you disagree with me, go for it. Like, Tell me that I'm wrong, because I'd be happy to listen to like constructive criticism. It also improves me as a streamer, and it makes it more interactive. Okay, let's move on to Asyndeton and Polysyndeton. That just means you're repeating basically the sentence ends, or these, what's it called? The conjunctions. So Polysyndeton, for instance, is like this and this and this and this and this. And once again, it kind of once again creates emphasis. It goes hand in hand with anaphora in terms of like showing like the dog ate the food and he ate the bone and he ate this and he ate, and it brings attention to the fact that the dog ate so much food. So that's kind of what asyndeton and polysyndeton do. Also with antithesis, that is just a contradiction within a sentence. It's a little bit less broad than it's like more specific than juxtaposition. So basically you have two contrasting clauses in a sentence. What that does is it kind of puts emphasis. Once again, that word is really like broad, but it shows the different contrast between those two arguments. Assonance and consonants are just repetition of vowel or consonant sounds. Same thing as asyndeton and polysyndeton. What you're essentially doing is you're trying to create an impact on what is being repeated. Hyperbole is just an exaggeration. You probably learned this in middle school or freshman and sophomore year. It's just kind of showing how how large a problem is and how it's exaggerated. There's also irony. There's a bunch of different types of irony, but irony occurs when you have some kind of blatant contradiction. So verbal irony exists, and so does like situational irony. I don't think that comes up as much in nonfiction rhetorical analysis. It will usually appear in like fiction articles, so you probably won't see a lot of that. Juxtaposition is the contradiction or the contrast of two opposing ideas, broadly speaking. So you could be talking about light and dark and like happiness and sadness, things like that. Like when you see two different thematic ideas being presented in some kind of article, like in the context of that specific article, that is juxtaposition. And the reason why authors would ever would contradict themselves is maybe they want to build credibility. They want to do like that. It's ethos, basically an appeal to credibility, because they're trying to be like, oh, we're conceding the opposing arguments, but we're kind of placing emphasis and showing that our argument is more correct because you're rebutting the counter argument. That's what juxtaposition sometimes does. Parallelism, we just saw being used by Barack Obama in his Pathos, but you also see parallelism exist in a bunch of different contexts. So when authors use the exact same structure of like adjective, noun, verb over and over, it kind of creates this kind of like feeling in the audience that, oh, they're building up to something. Oh, they're trying to basically show us that this specific argument is important. That's what parallelism is. Paradox is a blatant contradiction within itself. It once again goes with juxtaposition and antithesis. I don't think you'll usually see this as much in your nonfiction prompts. There's also personification, simile, and metaphor, which are basic figurative language terms that you learn freshman and sophomore year. Personification is when inanimate objects act as humans, and simile and metaphor are just comparisons. So simile and metaphor function similar to analogy. I think they're usually like logos appeals because you're trying to make that comparison to people's lives. And personification just kind of creates some kind of pathos. It's like not real, but the speaker or whoever is like giving the speech or writing this article, they're just trying to kind of appeal to that audience's, like maybe they're trying to be funny, or maybe they're trying to make you angry or passionate. And symbolism you'll see in almost every single rhetorical analysis for the most part, especially ones that are talking about like really broad social issues like women's rights, like women's voting rights, for instance. So symbolism just means they take like an object to symbolize a whole movement or a whole like purpose. And you'll usually like the reason why authors would ever like use a symbol is because they're trying to create some kind of comparison or represent the entire whole with just one object, and it makes the audience like understand it and comprehend it a little bit better. So that was a mouthful. Like, so if you like want me to re-explain any rhetorical devices, or you really want me to like kind of talk about anything else about rhetorical devices, I'd be happy to talk about it. Yeah, sure. Okay, so asyndeton is the omission of conjunctions, and polysyndeton is the like overuse of conjunctions. So for instance, Asyndeton would be like I'm trying to think of Asyndeton off the top of my head. I haven't seen it in so long. It's like the dog ate the food. Why am I using the dog so much? Like the student went to school with a backpack that had books, calculators, something, and then like books, calculators, a phone, textbooks, notebooks, period. So the lack of a conjunction there makes it polysyndeton. It makes it asyndeton. A just means without, right? So asyndeton just means they did not have conjunctions. It kind of creates this like, oh my God, there's so many things, it's so long, that kind of feeling, if that makes sense. Polysyndeton is when you use conjunctions too much. So it's like the boy brought in his backpack textbooks and calculators and notebooks and papers and something like that, right? So that kind of creates the same kind of effect, I would say. Like, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff. It's like building up to something. Anaphora is when you repeat the sentence beginnings. So the darkness consumed us. The darkness makes us motivated. The darkness scares us. That's what anaphora does. It's all the same thing in terms of repetition. I just think when you like with anaphora, you're putting the focus on what that first thing that does. So like the thing that you're repeating, like in my case, the darkness, you're putting emphasis, you're focusing, like the audience is looking at what the darkness is doing, right? But with asyndeton and polysyndeton, you're kind of examining that list of things, like the backpack had the textbooks, the calculators, the papers, etc. So the focus is on two different things, but they have the pretty much the exact same purpose, which is to repeat to the point where it shines light on that thing. Does that make more sense, I guess, in terms of like how you can identify it? Because I mean, the stream is identifying what's worth analyzing. I hope I explained the difference. Great. Okay. So we're going to go into a quick review session. Remember, this is the second to last slide of the stream. So if you have any other questions about rhetorical analysis, feel free to leave them here. I'm just going to talk about what we did in today's stream. So first, we looked at the three-step process of identify, decide, and analyze. What that means is first you have to identify if there's a rhetorical device. Second, you have to decide if it's worth putting in your essay, if it actually contributes to that author's purpose. And finally, you have to analyze. You have to show how, first, why that author used the rhetorical device, and second, how the use of that rhetorical device actually impacts like the purpose. Basically, does it make the audience feel more motivated to act on something? We then talked about our first read. So after you read for the first time, you don't want to just start writing. You want to be annotating. So what that means is you're not just underlining rhetorical devices and writing syntax, writing simile. You want to explain explicitly how that rhetorical device connects to the purpose and what tone it indicates. That's also another thing. After you read the passage for the first time, you want to talk about the author's purpose, write it like down somewhere. Also, you want to make note of any tone shifts or the tone throughout the passage and who the audience is. That's really important. Then we covered the difference between ethos, logos, and pathos. So appeals to emotion, appeals to credibility, and appeals to logic and reasoning, and how that happens. Remember, ethos, logos, and pathos don't just exist. They are communicated through things like analogies for logos, or what are those? Parallelism for pathos, or even like allusions for ethos. So remember, rhetorical devices and ethos, logos, pathos go hand in hand. One communicates the other. Then we talked about rhetorical techniques like diddles, diction, imagery, details, language, and syntax. So any kind of like differences in sentence structures or key details that impacts their argument, or even imagery and diction that kind of communicates the author's argument. So remember, you can't just say that the author uses diction or the author uses imagery. You have to be as specific as possible. That means that the author used sad diction, or diction that made the audience feel passionate, or imagery that created some kind of illusion in the audience's head of the author's message. So you have to be very specific when you're talking about your imagery and when you're talking about your syntax. And finally, rhetorical devices in our passage. So we went over a long, exhaustive list of rhetorical devices that could potentially show up in your AP English language rhetorical analysis prompts. So that's things like ethos, logos, that's things like illusion, anaphora, asyndeton, polysyndeton. And in fact, fun fact, you can actually do things, when you finish your AP English language exam, you can do what's called requesting your free response booklets. So I actually have my AP English language rhetorical analysis prompt from last year right here. And I can tell you that from that passage, we talked, like, rhetorical analysis, as you may or may not know, is the second prompt in your packet. So you're going to do synthesis, then rhetorical analysis, and then you're going to conclude with your argument essay. So when I look down to like this booklet that came from AP English language, like the first thing I noticed is that, like, for instance, like our passage was about Mahatma Gandhi, right? So the first rhetorical device that I found was anaphora, when he says things like, they preyed upon another far more numerous, far more ancient. That's an example of anaphora. And then you have to talk about that repetition and how that creates, like, it helps build towards persuasion, right? Then I gave another example of emotional appeal and a call to action. Those are all examples of how an author can use rhetorical devices and rhetorical techniques to kind of communicate their essay and communicate their prompt. So that is it from me. My last question is, do you have any questions or anything you want me to go over, or anything you want me to repeat? It can be about rhetorical analysis. It can be about anything AP English language related. You can even ask me questions about Fiveable. I'd be happy to answer them. And I will leave the next minute or so for questions. So feel free to leave questions in the Ask a Question tab, or you can ask questions in the chat. Like, you can ask me questions, what prep did I do for the AP exam, things like that. I'd be happy to answer. Actually, I will add one thing before I answer a few questions. Remember that the AP English language prompts are different this year. It's now 1-4-1. So what that means is you can get 1 point for your thesis, 4 points for evidence and commentary, and 1 point for sophistication. Sorry, I'm like out of it today. So what that essentially means is that you have to have a strong thesis. And in your thesis for rhetorical analysis, like, I'm sure Stephanie Kirk, who's going to be streaming in 2 days, tune into her stream at 8 o'clock Eastern on Wednesday, because she's going to tell you what you need in that thesis and in that introduction paragraph. But it's really important that you talk about how they use rhetorical devices to build their purpose. So by annotating, like I said earlier, by writing down that author's purpose, it really helps you out in the future when you're writing that thesis to get that easy thesis point. For evidence and commentary, it's really important that you explain, when you're explaining why the author is that rhetorical device and how that device helps contribute to their purpose, or how it builds persuasion, that is the core of those 4 points. And remember, that is 2/3 of your, like, rhetorical analysis essay. Like, 2/3 of the points you get are from the evidence that you pick and the commentary you use to accompany it. So it's really important that you do both. Okay, so I think that is pretty much it. I don't think anyone has any other questions, but if you do, I believe Stephanie Kirk would be happy to answer them. Also, I know that each month, I do my current events stream monthly, but there's another streamer, Ashley Johnston, I believe, who does an article of the month. And I think that is one of the best streams that you could use if you're confused about rhetorical analysis. What she does is she goes through an article and, like, highlights, oh, this is an example of a rhetorical device. And then she explains, like, they use this rhetorical device to achieve their purpose. So go attend those Article of the Month streams by Ashley Johnston. They are excellent streams, and you should definitely go check them out. I also encourage you to come to my current event streams and all the rhetorical analysis streams that are happening for the end of this month and the start of next month. There are no further questions. Thank you all so much for coming and being such an interactive audience. It feels great to not feel like I'm talking to a computer and actually talking to real life people. So thank you so much and have a good night, guys. Thank you.